All right, my name's Brad Whittle. I'm here with Father Mark Keene, the pastor at St. Agnes Parish in the Diocese of Covington. And we just wanted to talk and have a conversation about science and truth, objectivity versus subjectivity, and then how that relates to our faith. One question I guess we could start with is just the idea of science being the end-all, be-all, or is there any truth in science, and how much should we trust science, and what is science telling us, and does it point to the truth? Those kinds of things.
Well, I think science is obviously an amazing and very powerful tool that we've developed to understanding the natural world that we live in, and the parameters, and that sounds kind of a technical term, but the parameters of our existence really as human beings in the natural world that we inhabit. And it's, as I say, it's quite amazing and beautiful and powerful. Everything from cosmology to particle physics and so forth like that. And certainly if you're very much advanced in biology and biochemistry, and the results that has meant for medicine and the production of treatments or development of treatments for diseases, and not just acute diseases, but long ongoing types of chronic illnesses. It's all been pretty amazing. And of course, that's just the application side of it, but just the beauty of it in itself. I'm thinking of a cartoon that I once saw where it showed the difference between a science supporter and a scientist. And the science supporter was the one who was saying, "Oh, look at all the cool applications you can have for all this science." And the scientist, his language was a lot more colorful than what I'm going to say here. But it just say, "It's just so awesome to see it, to understand it," which is true. I've always liked that aspect of it too. And for me, seeing all this in the context of creation, is that that idea of Thomas Aquinas, you can know something about a watchmaker by the watch he makes. He tells you something about the creator by creation. And I think sometimes, again, this is a kind of a technical term that sometimes gets used, but people get scandalized by the particularity of things. Like, well, why did God make the world this way? Why didn't it maybe be made other ways? And I've often thought that, God is the creator and we're the creature. So there's always going to be limits to the creature. There's always going to be parameters within which we have our existence. And when we bump up against those, we kind of question, well, why is that so? One of the big parameters, of course, for us is death and suffering. And, like I say, every time I think we kind of bump into the parameters of our existence, which in many ways are described by the natural sciences, then we're kind of at our limits at our creaturehood, so to speak. And God, yes, I think God could have made those parameters any infinite number of ways, but this is the way it is, and there's, with all of the drama and beauty and tragedy of human existence, and all of our efforts to try to make sense of it and find sometimes poetic beauty even in the ups and downs, the comedy and tragedy of it all. It's just it's the world we know. I've always had this maybe a different tact here with the sciences, and particularly when growing up in the Catholic schools where sciences were taught, including things like evolution and all that sort of thing, that it was like, well, the church is teaching me this, which sort of following the logic backwards is what sort of like, well, Jesus or God, this is all part of, the church's search for truth and trying to find it and use it to help us live our lives in a better way. And certainly the natural sciences, as I say, with so many of the applications, they've, I think, improved the quality of existence and in many, many ways of life. When I was first ordained, a priest that I served with had a brother that died of an appendectomy, and he was like 17 years old. You don't ever hear of anybody, dying of appendectomies today anymore. We know what it is, how to treat it, If they do rupture, then you can treat them with antibiotics. I mean, there's just so much more that we have in our arsenal to sort of treat situations like that and handle them in ways that are effective. But, at the end, there are limits to our understanding, and that's where I think faith does come in. The why of creation and even the how, the idea that, you can't escape the fact that you exist. I guess that's what Descartes' thing about, I think, therefore I am. I think a lot of times people interpret that to mean, well, that by my thinking I'm creating myself. And I think Descartes was trying to find, well, what's the one sure thing in life he can know, and that's that he existed. Even if I'm dreaming all this, it's still, I can't escape the fact that it's me that's dreaming, I exist. And from that, of course, he built his philosophy. But it is, in the end, a mystery. I mean, the fact of existence, and as people of faith, and particularly in a Judeo-Christian tradition, is that this has all been the result of a God who loves us, and creation wasn't just an event many, many millennia ago, but is an ongoing event at every moment. The time itself is a creation of God, so to speak, and if you read the cosmologists and so forth, there's even thought that time is an emerging dimension of our existence, that it emerges out of much more fundamental things in particle physics and the things that they get into. And it's fascinating. It's I think back about a biochemistry teacher I had at the University of Kentucky, and he was from China, and no lie, his name was Dr. Hu. And anyway, he spent a week talking about hemoglobin and all the polypeptide chains involved in that, amino acids, and just the differences between the hemoglobin you have when you're in your mother's womb versus when you're right after you're born. Your body does this huge transition. And of course, the hemoglobin in your womb when you're in the womb, your mother's womb, is a little more sticky for oxygen than your mother's, so it can pull it away from your mother and the placenta and so forth. And likewise, it's a little less sticky for carbon dioxide, so your mother's hemoglobin can pull that away from your hemoglobin. And there's only like 4 amino acid differences, I think, between those two, but it makes all the difference for having a healthier pregnancy when you're before you're born, and then after you're born, being able to live in this world a little more effectively. And it's incredible when you think about it. But at the end of all these lectures and so forth, this Dr. Hu, he just said, whoever designs this, very smart, very, very smart. And I often joked that was probably the most authentically and purely religious statement I heard it the whole time I was at the University of Kentucky. But he was right, and this teacher had been very masterful in the way he presented this rather arcane sort of, not arcane, but just, most people obviously don't know about all that sort of stuff, but it was really just the beauty of it all. And that's just a very simple process within our very complex biology as human beings. But I find all that just tremendously fascinating. And I guess a simple answer is a few months ago, a student in one of our high schools called to interview me. That was part of an assignment they'd been given to interview someone about their vocation. And one of the questions she asked was, well, how can you give your life to something that you have no proof of? And I understand the question, and I said, well, it's true. I can't prove that God exists the same way you can prove things in science or nature or empirically. I said, but on the other hand, I can't prove that God doesn't exist either by empirical means or anything like that. And in the end, I always see faith as something that you give yourself to. All the scriptures and different things like that, at the bottom line is a description of God. The creed is a description of God and what we believe God has done for us in creation and redemption and sanctification. But beyond that, it also says something about, well, this is the type of God God is, which I think is a wonderful idea of this loving God. I may not be able to understand, given my human limitations, all the aspects of what God has in mind, but I think the image I get from Scripture, from other, even non-Christian religion, the way they write about the deities or deity, gives you a sense of ultimately that there's a goodness that's associated with God that's a transcendent sort of goodness. And, that's very attractive, very appealing. And I know you often talk about the transcendence, the good, the beautiful, and the true, and that us being created in the image and likeness of God. And I'm trying to think, I think Bishop Robert Barron wrote about this, but you think about your mind, and and your mind sort of is by nature, you want to know the truth, you want to figure out things, whether it's in the natural sciences or anything. You keep wanting to know what is true, what's the most basic truth, and you keep digging at it. So it's like our minds are almost have a passion for this. And goodness, we're attracted to goodness in things that we do. I mean, even Catholic theologians, Thomas Aquinas said we only do things because there's a goodness in them that attracts us to do it. Attracts, I believe they say, is the object of the will, the good. Now, sometimes it's good as perceived, and that perception isn't always what it ought to be. And of course, that's part of what learning is about, and experience and teaching is about. So. One last thing, just regard to science, because I understand sometimes people think that there's a animosity or a rivalry or whatever between Catholic Church and science, and I'm never quite sure where they necessarily get that from. People often will trot out Galileo, and the Pope apologized for that mistake, but there are a lot of physicists that have been very religious people. Isaac Newton, who's considered one of the greatest physicists, was a very religious person, from what I understand. And Galileo, I think, was also very religious himself. But you look at George Lemaitre, I think is probably one of the most accomplished. He's dead now, but he got in a few discussions with Albert Einstein, and eventually was proven that he was correct about the universe and what we now call the Big Bang Theory, or that was originally a rather derisive term that was used about it. But Lemaitre, just an amazing mathematician. His contributions to science, that even about an expanding universe, that even apparently preceded Edwin Hubble and Henrietta Leavitt, who worked with Hubble, he's a Catholic priest. The Vatican has an observatory. That's the word I'm looking for. And I think it's out in Arizona, and they've also got one near the Vatican City, I believe. And they're very much interested in science and committed to it. And Gregor Mendel and his Benedictine monk, and his contributions to the whole area of genetics. That's been quite a few years ago. I think maybe at least a couple hundred. But, there's been plenty of people over the years. A Sister Mary Kenneth Keller, I think, is one of the first, maybe the first woman in the United States to get a degree in computer science. And close to home, I had an aunt that had advanced degrees in physics, and also was a programmer with Fortran language. This is back in the 1960s when it was a new thing. The idea that the church is opposed to science and its advancements, I think, is misplaced. Misplaced understanding about what faith is and its role. So.
Sorry, I kept grabbing your mic, thinking you were done, and you had more to say each time. Yeah. One thing I think is interesting that you kind of mentioned about subjectivity a little bit, especially like more today and in the past maybe 50 or 100 years. And when we talk about like, I know what it was now.
Okay, good. Yeah. Sometimes you just got to admit, okay, I lost my train of thought.
Yeah.
People understand that. So.
Yeah. Sorry for the hiccup. I lost my train of thought.
I can be part of this too. Yeah.
So talking about subjectivity, we also can talk about a bit about people always saying, the church needs to get with the times. Science says this, so the church should recognize that that's the truth, even though there's maybe not tons of evidence for it, or even if it's just incorrect, and science hasn't yet come to that conclusion. So can we talk a bit about that?
Well, I guess I kind of see the one other thing is the area of subjectivity versus objective truth. I shouldn't say versus. It's not like they're against each other, but we all are, as individuals, we all experience things differently. I mean, that's the way it is when we see things differently, and the subjective experience is a reality. But that's the key word there, is experience. The way we experience things is subjective. But but there is an objective reality that we are experiencing. I mean, I can talk about that painting on the wall over here in the chapel, and I see it one way, and you see it another way, and it has an emotional register with me, maybe one way that is the same or maybe very different from your own. It doesn't change the fact that that's what's there, though. It's the painting, and I suppose a more objective thing that's maybe elusive as of right now is what the painter was trying to communicate by painting it the way he did. But that would be, and that certainly would be something worth exploring to see. Well, the painter was successful, I guess, because his painting is eliciting in me what he intended, or maybe he failed in the sense that, what he was trying to communicate wasn't, or maybe it's I don't understand all the symbolism and stuff that he or she used, so therefore I'm missing out on things. So I often think that's sort of when you walk into a painting like a Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and all that, where there's all this imagery from the Bible and from mythologies and from culture of the day and all that, and you can say, wow, what beautiful colors and what beautiful figures, but if you don't understand what's there, you don't have a certain literacy about that, you're missing a whole lot of what Michelangelo was trying to communicate. And but ultimately I think we think there almost by our nature we're sort of acting on the assumption that there is an objective truth, or else we wouldn't be always trying to find out, what is the truth and so forth. Now, it gets to be another question as far as, within, and how we behave. And, the Catholic moral tradition has made sort of accommodations in the sense that, okay, well, you can say, well, should you tell... obviously you should be truthful, you shouldn't tell a lie. But then the example that was always being brought up when I was a kid was, well, what if you're hiding Jewish people during World War II and the Nazis come to your door and ask if you're hiding Jewish people? I don't know if that is a scene sort of like that in The Sound of Music, where the nuns, I think they take out the starter cable or the battery cable of a car of the Nazis when they come to search for the family there, but in their convent. But so I guess they didn't out, and I think maybe they did actually lie too. But anyway, is it okay to be untruthful in that sort of situation? And then you get into debates about, well, does a person who maybe doesn't have a right to the truth, is it okay lying to them? Or if you're under fear from the threat of yourself or somebody else, that is a thing that sort of impinges upon your culpability. And we try to weigh that. I mean, and take that sort of thing into account. I think as a general rule, it's a pretty good rule that we should always try to be truthful. And certainly in the whole realm of psychology and in recovery programs, truthfulness is a very important tool, even if it's painful truths. And of course, sometimes they really are. Sure.
I didn't want to just grab the mic and try to rip it from you. Would you say that that's similar to... Would you say that that's similar to the idea about thou shalt not murder, rather than thou shalt not kill? Because sometimes killing can be justified, whereas murder is always wrong. So telling the truth, or lying would be always wrong, but at a certain point you're not lying because they don't have the right to the truth anyway.
Well, that's where that's where you would maybe draw a line. You're very right. I've always thought thou shalt not murder is sort of what they call a teleological statement. You're saying, the wrongful taking of a life, which is what murder is. So you're saying the wrongful taking of a life is wrong. Well, you're just being redundant then. Is killing always wrong? Well, obviously, taking another human being in his life is always serious, very serious. But we've always, what about when you're in a war? What if you're a sniper? I mean, you're there, you're not only shooting somebody who's maybe actively trying to kill you, but you're picking off. Is it part of the greater good, for the cause that you're serving? You get into some pretty, serious and heavy moral thought problems, and then, of course, if you're the one that's actually having to implement it, it's more than a thought problem, it's a reality.
Talk about intrinsic evil.
That's where that sort of comes in, is under objective realities. We can usually fairly easily think of things that would always be, just be wrong. You would
Could you say the
think.
term so that they can hear you?
Intrinsic evil is what we're talking about. It's sometimes maybe harder to describe in certain situations, because sometimes you can always think of a situation that maybe would even be worse. People always try to sort of thought problems to trump a certain situation, but and I'm trying to think of one right now offhand, that it's hard to think, well, would there ever be a justifiable time or justifiable circumstance in which you could, talk negatively about somebody? That seems like in some ways a simple thing, but I can't really think where it would ever really be justified that you would, deliberately talk about somebody in a way that was negative or slanderous or calumnious about somebody. Sometimes in certain circumstances, and again, that's sort of like the murder thing. You calumny or slander, it's like saying, well, talking badly about somebody is always bad, or badly talking about somebody behind their back is always bad. Well, that's kind of an obvious. Sometimes, in certain situations, you have to talk truthfully about somebody, and you do that because you're trying to serve maybe a larger purpose. Whether it's go ahead.
I was thinking, for instance, when you're interviewing people for a job, and you say they had these great qualities, but there were also, I need to be honest, there were some qualities that we maybe wouldn't be fitting for the job. And it's not that we're, bashing the person, we're just being honest. This was a quality that didn't exactly, match with what we're expecting.
Yeah, in fact, that's kind of an example that comes to my mind. People, sometimes you hear people throw out that who are you to judge, or thou shalt not judge, and there's a lot of circumstances in life where you have to make judgments, which is not the same thing as judging a person, and you're judging actions, or you're judging, like you in your example of you're hiring for a position, and maybe you need somebody to be a public relations person, which means they need to have certain people skills, they need to be maybe outgoing, maybe more extroverted. And if from the interview with somebody you get the impression, well, they're very thoughtful, but they're more introverted, or maybe they just don't have good interpersonal skills. It's demonstrated by the interview, which is part of why you have an interview. Then you make a judgment. You say, well, it's not saying they're a bad person or incompetent person. It's just that they wouldn't be what you need for the job that you're envisioning, and particularly. If you're a person in management and you have responsibility, and this person would be working with a team of other people, you also have those responsibilities too. So, there's a difference between judging a person, and that's what I think when we say you shouldn't, who are we to judge, is to say, well, I can't judge this person's value in the sight of God. My fallback position is always, if the person's here, the only reason they're here is because God wants them to, which is in my book, a pretty substantial reason. So if I'm having trouble with it, I got to deal with it, because God's the one that has placed this person on earth and placed them maybe even providentially in my life to maybe, for whatever reason, to maybe rethink some of my thoughts about people or actions or things. But that's a thing we have to deal with, and that's. Kind of part of the whole human experience is things just don't seem to always mesh perfectly. You get pulled out of your comfort zone. You get challenged on thoughts or even things that you later see were prejudices or, habitual ways of looking things at people that just aren't helpful. And you become, aware of your own, we all are always, I think, kind of being programmed, so to speak, by our experience. And probably on a lot of occasions, our experience trains us well for the things we encounter in the future. But there's other things that maybe aren't such good preparations, and therefore we need to kind of be willing to look at those sorts of things and be careful about knee-jerk reactions to certain situations. And,
So I was going to ask if I could take it from there.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
All right. I was wondering if we could move on to the next topic I had for us, which is about faith and reason, and at what point one uses reason to help them understand about creation and objective truth and subjectivity as well. But then at some point, you rely on your faith, and that comes into play. So could you maybe describe for everyone, at what point does that occur? At what point should you make that transition? And maybe you could talk about Dante's Divine Comedy, like you've been talking to me about a little bit.
Well, I'm kind of reminded in this analogy, like if you're familiar with science, there's kind of a world of difference between classical physics, which deals with sort of the objects we're used to dealing with in life, and classical physics got us to the moon and back, and large type things like that. But quantum mechanics or quantum physics, it's like a whole different reality. And scientists are always saying, where's the transition point between, and how does that transition get made between things on the quantum level or Planck's level or that very small level and the world we know? Well, kind of there's sort of the same thing. Where do you make the transition between the empirical world, the world that we live in, the world of our senses? It's not a bad or inferior sort of thing. It's where we live. It's part of the parameters of our existence, as I say. And for me, I guess over the years, more recently, is the notion of seeing faith as, in the end, it's certainly not a somehow contorting your mind to believe something that you, in maybe other circumstances, would think is ridiculous or whatever. And sometimes people sort of act like that's what faith is sort of believing in these fantastical things. In the end, I think, faith is, okay, I'm willing to give myself, and by give myself, you could say, and live my life according to this sort of vision of life that includes a God that is good and gracious, even if I can't empirically prove this God's existence and how creation came about. Like I say, I can't prove it. I can't disprove it either, and no one else can either. That's sort of God plays his cards pretty close to the chest in that way, which is sort of interesting. George Lemaitre that I mentioned had an interesting way of describing that as far as God, not being God being subtle. I think Einstein even sort of said something along that lines, that God is subtle but not malicious, which I think is a good thing. So, the idea of giving, because there's more to human living than just knowing science. I mean, when you start getting into the area of loving people, you're getting into the area of giving and things like generosity and hopefulness and mercy, forgiveness, compassion, empathy. Those are not, I suppose there might be some sort of metrics you could develop that would maybe help you to measure those to some degree, but in the end, they're sort of beyond, but yet we all think they're of value, or most people think they're of value, I should say, or I imagine. And so, I think at least the older I've gotten, the more I think, okay, I'm giving my life as a Catholic Christian and as a Catholic priest to this notion of this God that is gracious and good, and that the whole idea of creation is good. And we as human beings, through our ignorances and blindnesses, have sometimes turned what's good into things that are not so good. How much of that is from evil sources or whatever beyond ourselves, or Maybe ignorance itself is, in fact, ignorance itself, I think, probably is. You could kind of consider it a form of at least a natural evil, so to speak. And, we got to deal with those mistakes and imperfections. But sort of the odd thing is we grow in interesting dimensions by dealing with our mistakes in ways that we wouldn't otherwise have grown, which I think is a very interesting way in which God has made the world, that that we kind of grow and mature through our experiences of things. And some of them are, just experiences that might be harsh, with not really so much a moral dimension to them, but perhaps some of the biggest lessons come when we fail in endeavors that have a moral dimension to them. And, we can still learn from that and grow. Maybe we become more deeper and more compassionate, probably less judgmental towards others in a whole moral sense. And, just allowing those lessons to affect our, I don't know what the right word is even, sort of our emotional disposition toward the world. I think sometimes the serenity that we seek comes from just turning to be patient and observing the world and observing our own reactions to it. I think that's one of the exercises in a lot of spiritual traditions, not just Christianity, is sort of just paying attention to your own emotional responses to things. And why did this thing here make me angry, and why did this thing here make me sad, or why did it make me happy? Just to sort of say, okay, well, because sometimes that leads you to things, okay, well, I need to really work and grow up in certain areas in my life. And then you sort of have to do with a little fun, playfulness with yourself too. I mean, you can become, I don't know how to say this, overly, without undercutting what I'm saying. Sometimes you can become overly serious about all this or take yourself too seriously, and that can almost make you more narcissistic than anything. But you say, okay, well, yeah, you sort of have to be able to laugh at yourself too, and even laugh at the severity with which you take all this. Yeah. But I've told you the story about this movie, Integrate Silence, and the first time I saw it, like for the first half hour, 45 minutes, I was like just going out of my seat, because it's a movie that was filmed on location at this monastery. There's no background music, there's no laugh track, there's no anything. All you get is the visions and the sounds of what's going on there. And of course, about 30, 45 minutes into this movie, I was crawling out of my skin. And then I kind of realized, well, maybe this is actually the point of the movie, because it's showing me to myself just how conditioned I've become to all that stimulation. And that maybe this is a whole message of what monastic life is about. Because once I kind of realized that was going on, and it still took a while, I started settling down though. And it's a longer movie. I think it's about 2.5 hours. So probably for the last at least hour and 15 minutes, I had kind of calmed down, and it really became one of the most engrossing movies I've ever, I don't even like to use the word watch, because that seems too passive. It really does, you kind of become, I guess, get a greater insight into the whole monastic vocation, and realize that it's not just a monastic for monasteries. I mean, there's a scene in this movie where there's this monk, he's cutting up this celery, and he's on this sort of gray stone-top table, and the colors are just so vivid of this green celery and this sort of bland gray, and these huge windows in this refectory where he's cutting this up, and you just see this wonderful sunlight, and it's, other than the sound of his knife hitting the stone tabletop, that's about, and him scooping up the celery and putting it in a pot. That's all there is. But it's a lot. It's really beautiful. And you all of a sudden become just aware of these other everyday experiences and just how rich they are. And that, like I say, sometimes people don't understand, why do people become monks? Now, it's kind of like a waste vocation or whatever, or a wasting of a life. And I've always, this movie kind of validates something that I've always suspected, that monastic life really is a very sensual lifestyle, but not because you're getting continually bombarded by all, from like we often are today, but because you've been subtracting all this other stuff, and then all of a sudden, very simple things become very, very rich. Like in this movie, now this was still in the part when I was still churning around, but the movie opens up with this, and it goes for about 10 minutes. It just shows this monk sitting in front of a candle and an icon, and all you hear is the sound of his chair creaking when he moves, and you can hear some wind blowing over the smoke pipe to his little wood stove he's got there, and you hear a fire crinkling a little bit. After about 30 seconds, you say, okay, I got this, but the movie says, well, not all the way, so you're there. But then it switched to this old monk, and he's cutting out the habit for a novice or an postulant or something. But I mean, just the sound of this monk cutting the cloth, and his hands, and obviously they're old and skilled hands doing that. It just, because I went back and saw the movie again, and and seeing it, knowing what to expect, it just made me get into the movie a lot more quickly. And it just, when you come back out into the noisy world we live in, it kind of has helped me to be more attentive to some of the just natural beauty that is there, the really enriching things in your life that are there, and often in very, simple things. And you can kind of allow yourself to get absorbed in that sort of thing.
Before the battery dies, because I don't have a power cable to this. I wanted to get in. That's actually a really good segue into. Of course, you mentioned my transcendentals that I always talk about. Ever since taking metaphysics, I like the transcendentals because they're good to think about: beauty, truth, and goodness. And we seek those things in the world rather than in God. They're imprinted. God's image is on things, of course, because He made them. So we're seeing some of that, or at least we think something's good when it's not, or something like that. But and we come to think about my last topic was going to be, it's turned off, science and the church. And when we talk about, we can kind of put all this together because people seek science as like that's truth for them, which there is truth there, but or people seek. Just beauty and fashion all the time, and that's it. It's all about looking good, being fit, because that's goodness, or beauty, or goodness is what I want it to be rather than what it actually is. So could we maybe talk about that just to wrap up?
Sure. I guess where to start with all that. Well, it is, but it's certainly worthwhile, just thinking about and discussing. I was thinking, it kind of gets down to learning to sort of be aware of the conditioning you have in your life and how that affects the way you look at the world, and being able to sort of move into a thing where you live your life more out of a sense of gratitude and just appreciation of things. I've often thought it's a good exercise at the end of the day just to look back over the day and think of things that you're grateful that happened. It kind of becomes a two-way street, because then during the day when you live your life, or at least in my case, I may be making those sort of mental notes without, I'm really glad I experienced that, or I saw that, or I heard that. Tonight when I go to bed, when I do my little litany of things to be grateful for, I want to make sure I remember that. And it kind of colors the way you begin to look at life. And I guess what I'm getting around to saying is that these transcendentals that we associate with God, and certainly believe that, the imprint of God is on all of creation, is in being aware of that is so very important. And now it's my turn to lose my train of thought as far as what was in the next part of your, the church and faith. Yes, the church and faith. And, I think, I don't think it's necessarily helpful to go back to the Middle Ages when sort of science, culture, and religion, everything, but there was a greater unity there. And so if you started rattling one part of it, it rattled everything. I think today there's a greater sense that, there's scientific, empirical knowledge, and this is what it is, and its limits. And I know there's some people that choose to say, okay, well, that's all there is. That's all I want. And that's a choice they make. But they can't really substantiate in a metaphysical sort of way their position any more than I can substantiate my position, which is opposite in a metaphysical way. As I said earlier, I can't really prove that there is a God in an empirical sort of way, other than to say that, well, how else do you explain everything? Which,
5 ways, Aquinas.
well, Aquinas, Thomas Aquinas's proofs for the existence of God. I mean, they all point to the existence. They're consistent. I don't know that anyone would ever say that they're a airtight or waterproof empirical proof, but certainly they are worth thinking, and I think they help make a good circumstantial evidence sort of case for the existence of God. But if someone's determined to reject it, then they can, and from an intellectual standpoint. And that's why I kind of get into the whole area of things like. The transcendentals themselves really are not empirical things. Goodness, truth, and beauty are usually things we talk about in terms of experiencing or feeling. And, they're among our richest experiences as human beings. And, it's always interesting to me on retreats with adults, and if there's a kind of time when there's like a spiritual timeline, and if people bring up the birth of their, often bring up the birth of their children as being this immensely transcendental, mystical type of experience. And I can understand for good reason, I would think so. It's just to think, here's this whole new life, and where did it come from? And the only thing I have is analogous to that would be sort of at the end of when my dad died. He died at home, and we were fortunate to be able to have him to die at home. It's something he always wanted. But after he had passed away and we were in the kitchen, and my sister asked, "Where is Dad now?" A half hour ago I knew where he was. He was in the bedroom there, but where is he now? That's a very powerful question, because he was then, but now he's not. Where is he? And, same way with the birth of a child, 10 months ago, where was this child? But then it was conceived and grew in this woman's womb for all these months. And here it is, here's your future. Your life maybe flashes before your eyes, but then, everyone always, just talk about how beautiful their baby is. I kind of take a little segue here. My mom loves this show, and I think it's a great show too, called Call the Midwife. It's on PBS on Sunday nights in Louisville. And my mom, I almost like watching her watch whenever a baby's born on the show, because then they show it, usually there's always at least 2 or 3 babies born on the show. And she really, there's this almost like glow on her face when she watches that. And I remember one time I asked my mom about when she became pregnant with my youngest sister, which mom was 40, 41, I guess, when that happened, if she was worried about things like Down syndrome and some of the other concerns you have when you're pregnant at that age. And my mom, being a nurse, she understood what the possible risks were. But she said, I had this really wonderful feeling about being able to be part of bringing another life into the world. And I just thought that's sort of a remarkable thing to say, because often today, you on TV and so forth, you get the impression that having children is just a big pain, that there's this big imposition on your life, and you don't want to go there if you don't have to, type of thing. And that, she saw this as a beautiful thing, and that's beyond empiricism or anything like that. It's, I think, just a remarkable statement of where my mom's soul is, and kind of along those same lines, when my dad gave me the talk about the facts of life, so to speak, when it was all over, my dad rarely used a word like beautiful, but he said, Mark, it's all very beautiful. And I think just that one statement just really, I think, colored in a long way my view of sexuality and procreation, and that, and so much, of course, in our world today kind of cheapens all of that, and you bring up the whole, the physical beauty thing. I went to ask one of my sisters one time if they felt a lot of pressure with regard to the whole body image thing that you see in movies, on advertising and magazines and everything. And she said, yeah, it's pretty pronounced. She was either in high school or just getting out of high school when I asked her about all that. And I mean, she's 50 years old now, so it's, maybe not such an issue, but, I think we got Sports Illustrated when I was a kid, and I think my parents were fine with that every year except in January when the swimsuit edition arrived. And, without being prudes, but, obviously they, were concerned, I guess, about the image of women that was being given to me and my brother by that magazine. And, we kind of knew what or at least I did. I know you have to ask my brother about it. But, that this was not something that they were wholeheartedly behind, I guess, that they just weren't dismissive of, or just saying, well, that's nothing to be concerned about. I think they always were very concerned about, anything that would objectify people, but particularly based on physical beauty or erotic attractions, which of course, most swimsuits editions were not real modest in their presentations of women's bodies. So, I think, it's, there's more to life than just the science. As much as I love science and am fascinated by it, but there's other things, we have to always be, to be concerned about as human beings. We're not just biological, entities. If that was it, then, there's no point in having any form of civil law or anything like that if we're just machines, or chemical machines at that. But, so I think, the Catholic tradition, and that's maybe segueing back into what maybe you were hoping we'd get into eventually, is that, it's not just science that we've got a very strong tradition, and we're not the only ones, but we do have of looking at ethics and understanding what makes actions good and how should we live as human beings. And of course, a Catholic anthropology or Christian anthropology is not individualistic, is that we're social beings and that in moral considerations, we do need to keep in context, the communal good of things. I mean, I think today it's a great struggle in our culture is to getting people to look beyond themselves, that, maybe you should do this or that, and not so much because it's good for you, although probably in the long term, doing good for the community is doing good for yourself. They kind of has a way of sort of paying back, but it's a long-term investment that way than more immediate forms of gratification. But our Catholic tradition, and certainly in philosophy and theology and moral theology, but truthfully, I think the real beauty and richness you find in Catholic and Christian mysticism, contemplative writings and so forth, they kind of make, I think sometimes people experience moral theology, it's like this, finger shaking at you what you should or shouldn't do. But when you approach it more from a contemplative point of view, it's more of seeing the good, the beauty, and the truthfulness in other people and in situations and relationships, and feeling a real call to respect them because they are good, true, and beautiful. The Holy Spirit has a pretty remarkable way of working through those transcendentals. And maybe, when we resonate with the good, the true, and the beautiful, we're resonating with that part of us that is in the image and likeness of God. And I think when you have that sort of resonance, that good vibe, whatever analogy you want to look or imagery you want to use, it kind of helps you to keep your priorities maybe where they ought to be. For yourself and for your community, for your family, your whatever communities you're a part of. We're all kind of have a foot in a lot of different paths or doors sometimes. So.
All right. Well, thanks, Father, for doing this. It's been Father Mark Keene, and I'm Brad Whittle. I'm the seminarian here. So thank you for watching, and we hope we all learned a little something. So.
If I can steal the microphone back, just also to thank Brad for setting this up and He'll be doing some editing and all this, so hopefully we have something that's helpful for people. As I think my experience of Catholicism is just one of more in the realm of what he calls the transcendentals, and there's just the beauty of the rituals, the beauty of our image of God and what we believe our image of human beings are, and why we should treat them the way we do. And I think it's just quite remarkable. So I'm glad that he's given me this opportunity to. They always say you never learn something until you have to teach it or talk about it in a constructive, hopefully constructive way. So, this has been a good exercise for me too, in kind of helping my thoughts to get a little more in sync. So thank you very much. And for anyone who's listening, thank you for watching. I hope it's been helpful.